What scared you when you were a child? Puppets, spiders, darkness, clowns? What's seen in shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a young child, because our imaginations are so fresh, wild, and naive, and so even those things which were designed to entertain us as children could be truly terrifying. I'm the Absurd Word Nerd, and today I'm exploring some of the things which scared me as a young nerd, especially movies, TV shows, and media designed for young audiences. I'm presenting this as a video rather than a written blog post because this whole idea was inspired by Adam Johnston of the Your Movie Sucks channel, who created the Childhood Trauma tag for YouTube in October 2016. And since most of the media I'm covering is audiovisual, I felt it necessary to show you these things from my childhood rather than merely tell you. After some long reminiscence, I've found and organised a list of the top 20 things which traumatized me as a child, and I'm going to share the first 10 with you today. I've structured this video starting with items that scared me the least, building up to the ones that truly terrified me. So, without any further delay, let's begin with... OkiDoke was a highly sanitized and cutesy claymation show for little children, meant to teach them kindness, honesty, and working together. All of the characters in the show are woodland creatures like hedgehogs, mice, moles, squirrels, and toads. That is, of course, with one obvious exception. What the hell is this thing? This is the titular OkiDoke, and he looks like some kind of plant-clown hybrid. Ugh, what is he doing with his face? As a child, I didn't know what this imp-like creature was supposed to be, and I found it really unnerving, especially since every other creature talks by moving their lips, but his mouth was just painted on, and every episode opened with his overly happy, jangly theme tune. Not only does this music genuinely make me feel uncomfortable, but you pair this with the look of this thing. I often found myself changing the channel as soon as I heard the music, just so I wouldn't have to see that face. This show seems innocent enough now, but that face is deep enough in the uncanny valley for it to make number 20 on this list. As a kid, I was obsessed with Thomas the Tank Engine. It had lots of fun adventures, and I always had an interest in trains. In fact, I still do. Plus, that original theme song, in my opinion, is the best theme song ever made. I once heard a news story saying that young fans of Thomas the Tank Engine were getting scared of riding on real trains because there were so many train crashes and accidents on the show. But that wasn't what scared me. I thought the trains were all really fun, and I knew the crashes were just to make the show more exciting. No, what scared me was a very particular episode called Thomas, Percy, and the Dragon. It's a basic plot. Percy starts off bragging about how brave he is, and the next day he gets caught in a siding due to a jammed railroad switch. But as night falls, Thomas is sent to collect a load at the harbour, a paper dragon for an upcoming festival. And he passes by as Percy's asleep in the siding, pushing this glowing thing, which scares the bejesus out of him. As a young child, I didn't realise the dragon was simply sitting on top of a pallet car. I thought it was a special kind of train carriage, especially since it seems to blast steam as it passes by Percy, so I thought the dragon was another living train. I mean, some of the engines in rolling stock talk and some don't. How are you supposed to tell what's alive or not? The main way to tell is usually whether or not it has a face. But the dragon has a face. Ugh, and what a face. It looks like it's based on one of those ghoulish, scary masks from Japanese mythology. You know, the kind with the creepy eyes and the tongues that they stick out? It's designed to look scary, and it really worked on me when I was a child. It may seem old today, but this creeped me out as a kid. I remember a scene where it was sitting on a turntable, spinning around, and the other trains were watching it nervously. But this is a 10-minute episode, and that scene doesn't occur anywhere, which means that what I'm remembering must be a nightmare that I was having about this thing. And that's why it's number 19 on this list. This is a weird movie. It took me a few viewings to realize that these characters were literally supposed to be animals, because we recorded this from the television, and so the definition wasn't great. I didn't realize that the ratty actually had whiskers until my third watch of the VHS. And although this is based on a classic story, even as a kid, I could tell they'd added in the plot about the dog food factory. As weird as it was, I did enjoy this movie, but one scene that spooked me as a kid was the Weasel song number.
You see us? Then you don't.
This whole movie is grounded in a basic reality. Sure, there are talking animals, but they're regular animals on an ordinary riverbank with manners and money and motor cars. But this song introduces the idea of people magically appearing and disappearing, even being dismembered and put back together, and all in this early 90s cartoonish Photoshop effect, which moves in a weightless and unnatural way, and it really messed with my young head. Whilst I never had to look away when this one played, I think it's because it's relatively short, and like most villain songs, this is the best song in the movie. But as a kid, this made the weasels seem more like supernatural horror than simple, greedy, devious little thieves, and I always tensed up when the head weasel with the hat was on screen. If you haven't seen The Wind in the Willows, maybe you should try looking it up. It's also known as Mr. Toad's Wild Ride in America, and it's a quirky, fun family movie. It's only because of that one scene that it weaseled its way onto my list. As a kid, when I got home from school, I would basically binge watch the children's block on ABC Kids TV, no matter what was on. But one show that appeared in the early 2000s was Grizzly Tales for Gruesome Kids. In retrospect, this was a terrible show. It was full of poorly written morality tales, all with lazy animation, and it was entirely narrated, so with no voice acting except for the narrator when he read out the dialogue. So none of the actual cartoons were memorable, but each cartoon was bookended by a brief claymation skit with a creepy old man called Uncle Grizzly and his purple spider Spindleshanks. And sure, the narrator was a little creepy in some of those skits, but what really scared me was the opening scene. There's this hapless, red-headed victim who's lured into a decrepit cinema to watch one of the titular Grizzly Tales. And two things about this really got to me. As an adult, I can tell that the person in the ticket booth and handing out the, let's call them snacks, is meant to be Uncle Grizzly. But as a kid, I didn't know that, so I thought there were these horrific minions creeping around the cinema all the time, ready to attack at any moment. Plus, the snack bag that the kid eats from is always full of bugs, but they actually animated 3 different scenes with a different type of insect. So, although they literally never changed a single other thing about this intro, except for the bugs, as a kid I was always on edge that something different could happen, and maybe, just maybe, this time the red-headed kid would die before the start of the film. Now, sure, in retrospect, this is all in my head, and it shows that the people making the show did a good job at creating atmosphere in this little intro, even though the cartoons never lived up to it. But nonetheless, it did leave me a bit shaken, and so that's why it makes number 17 on this list. This one is pretty self-explanatory. Toy Story was a huge deal back in the day, so much so that they've had 3 sequels today, and of course one of the scariest parts were the mutant toys, or as I called them, cannibals.
They're cannibals.
I didn't know what that word meant when I was a kid, but what scared me was the combination of those uncanny faces and the fact that they don't speak. Why don't they speak? You have a mouth, don't you? Why don't you speak? Especially the character of Babyface. Look, I have 2 phobias. The first is arachnophobia, a fear of spiders, and the second is automatonophobia, which is fear of an automaton, basically a facsimile of the living form in a non-living counterpart. So, your statues, your mannequins, and dolls. So, Babyface, this mutant combination of the two, really creeped me out as a kid, enough to crawl its way onto this list. The Christmas tree. This one I spent the longest time doing research on, because I knew it was something that gave me nightmares as a kid, but all I remembered was that it was a 90s cartoon on VHS. Yeah, in the 90s, slapping a ton of cartoons onto a video and selling it to kids was a booming industry, so I really had my work cut out for me. Thankfully, I found a few uploads of these old videos online, and this was amongst them. This short cartoon is based on Charles Dickens' story of the same name, and in it, the spirit of Christmas is stolen by the evil sorcerer Mantu, and 2 young, plucky children travel through several fairy tale settings to go find it. But it wasn't the villain that scared me, despite the fact that he's clearly a racist Asian stereotype.
They've overcome the second obstacle. Well, they'll not get the essence of Christmas.
Rather, it was this scene, where two children are trapped underground by an ice dragon. Now, keep in mind, I was probably around 5 or 6 years old at the time, but I think that what really disturbed me was the fact that the children were safe, yet the dragon could still reach inside their hiding place to try to grab them, so even their safe place was unsafe. Then, on top of that, in order to stop the monster, they light a fire and melt him into a puddle. Not only did I find this scene scary as a kid, but I think the fact that the only way to stop the monster was to annihilate him really got to me. It wasn't the power of love or make him see the error of his ways, it was literally kill or be killed. And I had nightmares where I was stuck in the cave, and either I couldn't light a fire at all, or the dragon wasn't entirely melted away, and his dripping ice dragon kept trying to reach deeper and deeper into the cave, flooding it with his body in the meantime. This all seems so tame now, but as a kid, this thing truly horrified me, and that's why it's number 15 on this list. This one is admittedly a little different. There used to be this website called sfogs.com. It stood for Singapore's first online ghost stories. My brother showed it to me as a kid. It was a site where people submitted ghost stories, presumably from Singapore. I think I was about 12 at the time, but the fact that all of these stories were user submitted, and the stories were written like show and tell, was both fascinating and frightening, making it seem all the more real. I'm sure that these aren't all that rare now. I've seen my fair share of ghost forums and creepypasta, but as a child, I was intrigued, and I felt like I'd stumbled on something strange, adult, and sinister. After my brother had showed me, I even tried looking up the stories on my own, but what creeped me out most were the pictures that people had submitted. I thought that I was looking at a genuine ghost. These days, I don't believe in spirits or souls, and all of this ghost photography is pretty laughable. If you understand how cameras work, then you'll see that this stuff is either a camera dysfunction or just simply a hoax. This website doesn't exist anymore. However, I've learned that most of the content still exists on a new website called hungzai.com. It calls itself Singapore's freakiest online ghost stories. So, if you want to see this for yourself, you can still check them out. I don't think it's good content, but for me, it's quaint and nostalgic, and reminds me of why this is scary enough to make it at number 14 on this list. When I was a kid, around 10 years old, I was all about Goosebumps. I had some of the Goosebumps books, I saw the Goosebumps TV show, I got those weird glowing Goosebumps spoons from Pizza Hut, and even owned some of the Goosebumps board games. But at the time, Scholastic also had an equally popular series, Animorphs. Now, I never got into those books as a kid, but I saw them everywhere. All of the bookstores, all of the school library. I thought their covers looked really cool, but whereas Goosebumps was an anthology, Animorphs was all one story that was told episodically, so the idea of collecting that many books was a bit daunting to me as a kid. So, when they brought out the Animorphs TV show, I thought that finally I'd get my opportunity to see what all the fuss was about. Now, unfortunately, the Annie TV, it sucked. Some of the concepts were cool, but it was really cheesy, and I quickly lost interest. But despite only seeing about 3 episodes, there was one thing that scared me, and that was the Yerks. In case you don't know, Yerks are alien slugs that can crawl into your ear and take full control over your brain. This show was the first time I was ever introduced to the idea of aliens possessing human hosts, and this show presented it as though literally anyone could be a Yerk controller. As a child, I just could not deal with the idea that you couldn't trust who was an enemy and who was a friend, especially because the show made it very clear that if you ever revealed that you knew the truth, you would become the Yerk's public enemy number one. Although the show itself was lame, the idea of the invading brain slugs stuck with me for weeks and weeks after watching the first episode. I never remembered the name Yerk, and I barely know how to pronounce it today. I actually thought they were called earwigs. I have no idea why I thought that, probably mixed it up with something I'd learned in school. But for years, the idea of bugs going anywhere near my ears always made me feel uncomfortable. Because it reminded me of these Yerk earwig creatures. Oh, and I have to shout out Pop Arena, by the way. Not only did I use some of his footage for this, but Pop Arena's opinionated Animorphs reviews on YouTube are what made me a fan of the Animorphs books today. I highly recommend his videos. especially if you want to learn about Annie TV but don't actually want to watch this lame 90s hot garbage. LiL Horrors is an Australian puppet show starring several juvenile versions of classic horror movie monsters. It's a pretty silly show for young kids teaching friendship and honesty, the usual fare. The first thing you'll notice about this is that the puppets aren't as expressive as your Jim Henson style Muppets, and certainly the fact that these monsters always had these sardonic smiles did make this show really unsettling to me. But it was one particular puppet that made me want to change the channel when this show came on, and that puppet was Abercrombie the Zombie. I don't know why I believe this, since from what episodes I've seen, Abercrombie was always in the show. But for some reason, I had the impression that Abercrombie was a later addition to the show, who had once been an ordinary schoolboy that the other characters had killed and turned into a zombie because they wanted a new friend. Again, I don't know why I believed this, but this belief gave the whole show a sinister undercurrent that, although they joked and played around, these things were monsters, first and foremost. Plus, add on top of that the fact that Abercrombie was mentally inferior, and it gave the impression that Abercrombie was this struggling victim, in constant despair at his tortured, broken state. Not only that, but because every other zombie I'd seen on TV was shown to be a mindless killer, I always had this feeling that at any moment Abercrombie would snap and start trying to bite the other characters. And honestly, even today I find the design of his face and discolored skin really unsettling. This is Plasmo. I actually really enjoyed this show as a kid, since I'm kind of a fan of sci-fi, and this one played around with some cool sci-fi ideas for kids.
And maybe this whole universe is merely a blob of toothpaste on someone else's tooth.
If you've never seen it, it was an Australian-made claymation show, and each of the episodes were only about 10 minutes long since it was only a small production team, but it managed to do some interesting stories in that time. The show was about an orphan, shape-shifting polybop alien called Plasmo, who explores space looking for his parents, joined by his friends Corridor, Brucho, Pasty, and their pet Nick. After crashing on the alien planet of Munjo Troll de Klipdok, Plasmo and his friends spent most of the series exploring the planet and trying to fix their ship. And yes, I realise that the alien corridor does look like a talking one-eyed vagina. But that's not what I found creepy, and it wasn't even the spooky episode with alien ghosts. Rather, what I found most disturbing was an episode called Plasmo and the Bookworm. In this episode, they visit a library with a big, ugly librarian character, and he explains that something is destroying all of the books in the library. After some searching, they discover the little beast.
Nick's chasing it out of the bookshelf. Save me, call him off.
As a kid, I thought this creature was disgusting and disturbing, and I know it was designed to be naive with a childlike voice, but that high-pitched voice was grating like nails on a chalkboard.
I thought books contain knowledge, but the only thing I get from eating them is indigestion.
But what really struck my imagination was the fact that this thing wasn't vindictive, it wasn't evil, it was destroying books out of stupidity. And I thought that was such a disturbing idea as a kid, that someone would cause so much damage and destroy books for no reason other than ignorance. As a young reader, not only did I have a great respect for books, but the thought of something causing such destruction through all these bookshelves for no reason but stupidity, it really got to me. And the design of this thing with those creepy, buggy little eyes, ugh. If this looks interesting to you, most of the episodes are available on YouTube now, so I think it's worth checking out. But even now, I still think that you should be careful when you get to that episode. There's a reason why it's number 11 on this list. Well, we find ourselves at the halfway point, so I'm going to take a moment to catch my breath. Come back in the near future for the final top 10, and in the comments, feel free to psychoanalyze my younger self for any lingering phobias, and let me know if any of the items on this list scared you. Until next time, I'm the Absurd Word Nerd, and this is just the first part of my childhood trauma.